In the early 1980s, the U.S. Army quietly funded an experiment. Participants were placed in dark rooms, headphones over their ears, listening to a sequence of carefully designed tones. Some reported something the Army couldn't explain. They said they could perceive places that were not physically in front of them. Some described feeling as if another presence was there with them, and observers seemed aware that they were being watched. In 1983, an Army intelligence analyst was asked to determine whether those experiences meant anything at all. The document he produced was titled Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. It was not written by philosophers or mystics. It was written for military intelligence. The gateway process did not begin inside the government. It began with something one man could not explain. In 1958, broadcasting executive Robert Monroe began experiencing something strange. During deep relaxation, his awareness seemed to separate from his physical body. Not a dream, not a hallucination, something else entirely. Monroe said he remained awake. He could observe himself from outside the room. Monroe was not selling belief. He was an engineer who had spent his career designing radio programs and building broadcast networks. Signals, frequencies, transmissions. But what was happening to him had no explanation in those systems. At first, he assumed something was medically wrong. He visited neurologists and psychologists. The test showed nothing unusual. So Monroe began documenting the episodes himself, the same way an engineer investigates a malfunction. Session after session, he recorded what seemed to trigger the experience and what it felt like while it was happening. Also the clarity of the awareness that remained throughout. Over time, a pattern appeared. Under the right conditions, the experience returned. The events were consistent, and they could be reproduced. They existed outside anything medical science could explain. Monroe began experimenting with sound. He had spent his career studying how audio patterns influence the brain. Now he used the knowledge to investigate the phenomenon he was experiencing. Those experiments eventually led to the creation of the Monroe Institute in Virginia in 1974. The training system developed there became known as the Gateway Process. Monroe published accounts of his experiences. Soon, researchers began paying attention. Eventually, U.S. intelligence started asking one question. Was this his imagination, or was it something they could not afford to dismiss? Because during the Cold War, rumors had started reaching Washington. The Soviet Union was studying the limits of human perception. To understand why the Army studied the Gateway Process, you have to understand the Cold War mindset. During the 1970s and early 1980s, U.S. intelligence agencies received reports that the Soviet Union was funding research into unusual human capabilities. Psychokinesis, remote perception. Accurate or not, the possibility alone was enough. The United States had already launched its own programs. Project Stargate covered in Archive File 001, tested whether trained individuals could perceive distant locations using only coordinates. The results were inconsistent, but the program ran for more than a decade. That tells you something. The Gateway analysts approached the question differently. It was not focused on a few people with unusual perception. It asked something broader. Can perception be trained? And with the right tools, how far could an ordinary person be pushed? The report was written in 1983 by Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell of the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. McDonnell was not a scientist studying the mind. He was an intelligence officer asked to evaluate a system that claimed awareness could be trained. His job was simple: find out whether Gateway had intelligence value. or whether it was only producing vivid experiences that meant nothing. If this archive is worth keeping open, the subscribe button keeps the files coming. But the strangest part of the Gateway report wasn't the theory. It was the training system itself. The Gateway process was built around an audio method Monroe called hemisync. Two slightly different sound frequencies are played at the same time, one in each ear. The brain hears both tones and attempts to reconcile the difference between them. As it does, electrical activity in the two hemispheres begin to synchronize. Monroe believed this synchronization state allowed the brain to reach levels of awareness not accessible during normal waking consciousness. Participants begin with a condition Monroe describes as a mind awake, body asleep. The body enters deep relaxation. Breathing slows. Muscles release tension. And the physical sense of the body begins to fade. But awareness does not fade with it. The mind remains alert while the body becomes still. From that point, the training introduced progressively deeper stages called focus levels. Focus 10, completely physical stillness. The body feels distant, heavy, almost absent, but awareness remains sharp. Focus 12, participants describe expanded perception, awareness extending beyond the physical body. Focus 15, introduce something stranger. Participants report their sense of time begin to change. Past and future seems to exist at the same time. Focus 21 was the deepest level described in the report. Participants described the sensation of moving beyond physical reality entirely. Some reported perceiving environments that were not physically present. Others believed they were observing real locations. Some even describe encountering other forms of awareness, observers, presence that seemed aware that they were being watched. The Army report does not confirm these claims, but it takes them seriously enough to attempt an explanation. The explanation the report proposed was unlike anything in standard military analysis. At subatomic level, matter does not behave like solid objects. Particles behave more like probabilities. The report references ideas associated with physicist David Bohm. Bohm was not a fringe philosopher. He was a theoretical physicist whose work helped shape the 20th century physics. But his ideas moved into strange territory. He proposed that the reality we experience may emerge from a deeper hidden order. He called it the implicate order. The Gateway report applied that the idea to consciousness. If reality had a deeper structure and the brain existed inside it, then maybe the brain did not generate awareness, only receive it, a signal already present beyond the body. Individual's awareness was not separate from the signal. It was a localized pattern inside something much larger, and the brain was the filter. Under normal conditions, that filter kept perception locked in place. The senses, linear time, boundaries of the body. Gateway training was designed to alter that filter, but this was where the report became harder to prove. The theory was difficult to test. Researchers questioned the assumptions behind the model. Some inside the intelligence community doubted the conclusion entirely. And hemisync itself had never been independently verified at the level the report suggested. But the Army's question was not whether the theory had been proven, only whether could it be ruled out. If the model was correct, the implications were disturbing. The document was submitted through Army intelligence channels in 1983. There is no record the Gateway model was formally adopted. Still, the report survived, filed, copied, and decades later, quietly released during a routine wave of declassification. Then came the strangest detail in the entire Gateway file. Not the theory, not the conclusions. A page that should have been there, but wasn't. Page 25 was missing. Not redacted, not classified, just gone. For years, publicly available copies of the Gateway Report contained the same anomaly. The document moved directly from page 24 to page 26. The numbering continued as if nothing was missing. 24, then 26. The missing page was first noticed in copies hosted inside the CIA's FOIA electronic reading room. And the placement of the missing page made the absence harder to ignore. It sat directly between two sections of the report, right where the document shifted from theory to implication, which suggested page 25 had existed when the report was written, but was missing from the archived copy. So the empty space became its own mystery, not because the page was redacted, because it was gone. Some believed the page had been removed intentionally. Others thought it contained conclusions the government chose not to release. The simplest explanation was less dramatic. It may have been lost during copying, archiving, or declassification. Years later, a complete version of the report began circulating online. This time, page 25 was included. A version would later appear through the CIA's CREST database, and the missing page did not contain a normal footnote. It pushed the report further. If the Gateway model was correct, trained individuals might not only perceive distant information, they might perceive information outside the normal flow of time. Not hidden places, not distant targets, future events. The gap itself remained part of the story. An official military report about the limits of human perception, with one of its own pages missing. The Gateway Report was eventually declassified. Today, the full document, including page 25, is publicly accessible. But reading it does not close the file. It only changes what the file is already about. The report treated the Gateway framework as internally consistent. It presented the model as plausible, but the central claim remained unproven. The report does not resolve it. It only shows that in 1983, the U.S. Army believed the possibility was worth studying. So the file leaves one question behind. Was the Gateway studying consciousness beyond the body? Or what happens when the brain is pushed into a state most people never reach? If MKUltra explored what could be done to the mind from the outside, Gateway explored what the mind might reach from within. But the government did not stop studying consciousness. It only changed the direction of the search. And some of those searches are still buried deeper inside the archive, locked inside files that have not been opened yet. Archive file 003, closed. Next file, pending review.